Okay, let's dive in. You think about Dungeons and Dragons, and it's all about escape, right? Stepping into these amazing fantasy worlds, fighting monsters, exploring dungeons, creating stories.
Exactly. It's the original TTRPG, this huge cultural thing, 50 years old now.
But lately, it feels like this game world, this escape, has just been, I don't know, absolutely hammered by real-world drama.
Uh-huh. It's way beyond the usual forum chatter. We're seeing it in mainstream news, people weighing in you just never expect.
Even figures like, well, Elon Musk getting involved, which is something.
It really is a surprising amount of turbulence, especially for a game hitting such a big anniversary. And, looking at the sources we've gathered, it really says a lot.
About the game's current state, right? And the pressures on Wizards of the Coast, Hasbro.
And that whole relationship with the community, which seems pretty strained.
Exactly. And that's really what we're digging into today. We've gone through, well, a stack of different sources, articles, research videos, direct commentary from creators, people with deep ties to the game's history.
Yeah, a real mix.
Our goal here is to build a clear picture for you, the listener, of all these storms around D&D and its publisher, Wizards of the Coast WotC, owned by Hasbro, of course.
We're going to look at controversies going right back to the start, the business side of things with licenses and digital plans, Hasbro's financial situation.
And how all that stuff impacts the game's reputation, its relationship with players, with creators, the whole picture.
Our mission, really, in this deep dive is just for you, to help you cut through all the noise.
We'll unpack the key events, try to understand what they actually reveal about D&D, WotC, Hasbro right now.
And maybe think about what the future could realistically hold for the game, for the community.
And crucially, we're sticking only to what's in the material we reviewed. Think of it as your essential briefing. The dungeons, the dragons, and, well, all the drama.
Okay, so to really get a handle on the present, sometimes you got to look at how the past is being presented, or misrepresented maybe.
Which brings us straight to that first big controversy, the 50th anniversary making of D&D book.
Right. You'd think a 50th anniversary book would be, all celebration, nostalgia.
Yeah, a victory lap. But apparently, the introduction in this book, it caused a huge stir right from the start.
The core issue, based on multiple sources, was this one specific statement right near the beginning.
What did it say exactly?
It claimed the original D&D rules were, and I'm quoting loosely here from the sources, created by and sold to a wargaming community. It was almost exclusively white middle-class men.
Okay.
And went on to claim that those original rules offered, quote, little by way of roles for other players.
And that's where people connected to the game's origins really reacted strongly.
Oh, absolutely. Sources detail this deep, sometimes really angry disagreement with the historical accuracy of that statement.
What was their counter-argument?
Well, the main point, coming from people who were there or represent the creators' families, is that the original rules themselves, they weren't exclusionary like that.
They didn't specify demographics.
No. The argument is the rules just talked about the roles you needed to play the game. Universal things like the gamer, the player, the referee, generic terms.
So nothing in the actual text limiting who could play based on race or gender or class.
That's the core argument from these sources, yes. They insist the foundational text just didn't do that.
And the reaction wasn't just academic disagreement, was it? It sounds like it got pretty emotional.
Very emotional. One source really focused on quotes from Rob, identified as Rob Kuntz, the last surviving original D&D author. His reaction was apparently quite strong.
How so?
He reportedly felt it wasn't just wrong, but actually slanderous. He believed it was a deliberate attempt to, wipe out that success, erase the real history.
Wow, deliberate intent.
Yeah, and he reportedly even suggested the timing was suspicious, like maybe they waited until Gary Gygax, Dave Arneson, Jim Ward, Brian Bloom, until they were all gone and couldn't defend themselves or their work.
That's a heavy accusation, implying it was calculated.
It is. And according to the source, Rob saw WotC acting with this assumptive manner, a reprehensible judge, jury, and executioner demeanor.
Strong words.
He even apparently said he thought WotC genuinely feared Gary Gygax's name, that the name alone sends shivers up and down their crooked spines.
Real bitterness there.
Deep bitterness. The source quotes him calling the company a vile snake in stupid coastal wizards. He felt they were attacking the fandom, rewriting history.
Like evil robber barons, is that the phrase?
Yeah, parading as the good guys, driven by fear of a successful past they didn't create, and now trying to claim it. A really visceral reaction.
And it wasn't just Rob Kuntz, right? Gary Gygax's daughter also spoke out.
Yes, Heidi Gygax. Sources included her perspective, too. She defended her father's character strongly, said he was a loving father and husband, valued all his kids.
And specifically mentioned daughters playing D&D with him.
Exactly. Directly challenging that exclusively male idea. She said she was proud of him and that these negative accusations were resurfacing, but he was far from all that negativity. It adds a really personal family dimension to defending that legacy.
So this wasn't just staying within the hardcore D&D circles, it started to spread.
It definitely got wider attention. High-profile people started commenting. Mark Kern, for example, former dev head at Activision Blizzard.
What did he say?
He tweeted about Gygax and the others being erased and slandered, calling out the language in the book's foreword specifically.
And that tweet got a reaction from, well, Elon Musk.
Right. Probably the last person you'd expect to weigh in on D&D history, but yeah.
And his reaction was typically Musk-like.
Extremely. The source detailed his exact words responding to Kern. He reportedly said, "Nobody, and I mean nobody, gets to trash-eat GX, misspelling Gygax, and the geniuses who created Dungeons & Dragons. What the fuck is wrong with Hasbro, and why may they burn in hell?"
Okay, yeah. Pretty strong.
Very strong. The analysis in the sources suggests it was this passionate, maybe generational reaction. Less like a deep D&D expert, a grognard, weighing in.
More like someone reacting to perceived disrespect towards cultural figures from his time.
Exactly. People he sees as important innovators. But his comment definitely blew the story up to a much wider audience.
Okay, so let's bring us back to you, the listener. You're playing the game, maybe buying the books. Why does this fight over historical framing in a 50th anniversary book actually matter?
Well, it matters because it's about the game's identity, isn't it? Its origins, who made it, what its legacy is, how that story gets told or maybe retold.
Reflects on WotC's current attitude towards the game's own past.
Precisely, and towards the people who built it.
So how does a controversy like this, with these really strong reactions from people tied to the game's founding, affect how the community sees WotC?
Sources strongly suggest it tanks the trust level. Significantly.
Because if the founders' families and colleagues feel the history is being twisted,
it makes players wonder, well, can we trust WotC as the current stewards of this legacy? Do they even understand or respect where this game came from? It becomes about who's guarding the history and are they protecting it or changing it?
Right. And that theme of damaged trust, that disconnect between the community and the publisher, it just exploded, didn't it, with the next big thing we need to cover.
Oh, yeah. The open game license. The OGL fiasco. That was seismic.
Arguably the biggest controversy in recent memory. I felt like it shook the whole tabletop world.
Absolutely. Not just D&D.
So for anyone maybe not totally clear on it, what was the OGL and why was it such a big deal?
Okay, so the OGL, specifically version 1.0a from back in 2000, was this really innovative legal tool from Wizards. Sources describe it as basically formalizing the idea that a huge secondary market supports D&D by making compatible products.
So it let other people make D&D stuff legally?
Essentially, yes. It gave third-party creators permission to publish content using D&D's core rules, the mechanics, without needing special permission or paying royalties for using those basic systems.
Like treating the game mechanics as open source code for tabletop.
That's a great analogy used in the sources, yeah. It basically turned the system reference document, the SRD, which lists those core mechanics, into something anyone could build upon.
Whose idea was this originally?
Yeah.
Sounds pretty radical for a big company.
Sources point to people at early WotC, like founder Peter Adkison and designer Ryan Dancy. They were gamers themselves, apparently.
And they saw the potential.
They had this key insight. Players chew through content way faster than WotC could ever make it. So to make D&D really thrive, they needed to empower other people, indie creators, small publishers, to add to the ecosystem. The OGL was the legal key that unlocked that.
And did it work?
Phenomenally, according to the sources. Yeah. The OGL, especially with the 3rd edition SRD, was revolutionary. It directly led to huge successes.
Like Pathfinder.
Pathfinder is the prime example. It launched using the OGL when WotC shifted to 4th edition D&D. And it also fueled the whole OSR old-school Renaissance movement, making games inspired by early D&D.
So countless businesses basically built on this foundation.
Absolutely. Big publishers, tiny indie creators. It created this incredibly vibrant ecosystem. It seemed like a win-win. WotC had a massively popular game, and third parties could innovate and build businesses around it.
Okay, so a successful system for, what, 2 decades? Until Hasbro and WotC tried to change it?
That's what sources detail, yeah.
Yeah.
Late 2022, early 2023, reports started leaking about plans to basically cancel or authorize the old OGL 1.0a.
And replace it with something new.
Replace it with a much more restrictive version, often called OGL 1.1. The reported terms were pretty alarming for creators, things like needing to report revenue, pay royalties over certain amounts.
And didn't it give WotC rights to use the creator's own content?
Yeah, that was another reported clause granting WotC a license to use third-party material without paying for it. It set off massive alarm bells.
I remember the reaction. It wasn't just creators upset, was it?
No, the reaction was immediate, unified, and incredibly intense across the board.
YouTubers, content creators.
Sources say unanimous opposition from TTRPG creators. They organized fast, spoke out loud, and players jumped in too.
Canceling D&D Beyond subscriptions, right. Hitting them in the wallet.
Exactly. A very direct, tangible protest. And it worked in terms of getting attention.
It wasn't just gaming news either. This broke into the mainstream.
Yeah, Forbes, Bloomberg, CNBC major outlets covered it. It became a huge PR nightmare for Hasbro.
And sources mentioned it even impacted their stock price.
That was reported, yeah. That the community backlash actually seemed to punish Hasbro's stock. Shows the real financial clout of the D&D community when it gets mobilized like that.
The pressure must have been immense.
Undeniable. It forced them into a complete U-turn. Sources confirm they reversed course and they backed down entirely on the OGL 1.1 plan.
But the way they announced that reversal, that caused its own controversy, didn't it?
Oh, definitely. Sources called Hasbro's apology statement maybe the stupidest apology ever in the history of business, which is quite a claim.
Why? What did they say?
They reportedly tried to frame it not just as caving to pressure, but somehow as a mutual victory, saying something like, they, the community, won, and so did we, because making your voices heard forced us to change our plans.
Claiming victory when you've just been forced to back down? That is odd.
Yeah, as the source noted, it's a really peculiar way to communicate after getting hammered by your customer base.
So the old OGL 1.0a was ultimately deauthorized, but what replaced it wasn't the restrictive 1.1.
Correct. WotC eventually released the core 5th edition rules document, SRD 5.1, under a Creative Commons license.
And that's generally seen as better for creators.
Much better, yeah. Sources describe Creative Commons as even easier and less restrictive for third parties to use those core mechanics compared to the original OGL. A positive outcome from the whole mess, really.
But wait, wasn't there another issue even after that? Something about specific terms?
Yes. Even after moving to Creative Commons for the SRD, another little controversy popped up.
What was that?
Sources highlight that when they released the updated SRD 5.2 under Creative Commons, WotC apparently tried to remove or replace some specific iconic D&D terms that had been in the old OGL SRD.
Like what? Give me an example.
Things like changing deck of many things to the more generic mysterious deck, or Orb of Dragonkind became Dragon Orb.
Huh. Why would they do that?
Sources frame it as WotC trying to claw that back, basically pull those specific terms back under their exclusive intellectual property umbrella, make them proprietary, like Beholder or Strahd, which were never in the OGL.
So even after the big OGL reversal, they were still trying to tighten control on certain bits of IP.
That's how it was perceived, yeah. There were even some reported discussions about whether they legally could do that after those terms had been available under the OGL for so long.
Okay, so summing up this whole OGL saga, why does it matter so fundamentally to you, the listener, to the average player?
It's absolutely crucial because the OGL basically defined the whole world of D&D beyond just WotC's official books. For 20 years, it enabled this massive creative market of adventures, settings, new rules.
Stuff that lots of players use all the time, maybe without even thinking about it being third party.
Exactly. That ecosystem exists because of the OGL. Trying to revoke it wasn't just an attack on businesses. It felt like an attack on the diversity and creativity of the hobby itself.
And that really damaged trust, didn't it? Not just with creators, but with players, too.
Immensely. And while shifting the core SRD to Creative Commons was a good result forced by the backlash, that later attempt to reclaim specific terms, it just keeps those questions alive about WotC's real attitude towards sharing IP, towards that third-party market.
It highlights that ongoing tension, right? Corporate control and making money versus the kind of openness that let the D&D ecosystem boom in the first place.
Precisely. And that tension, that corporate strategy versus community impact, leads us right into the next big area. WotC's major push towards digital and, well, monetization.
Yeah, the sources really paint a picture of Hasbro having these huge plans for D&D's digital future.
Significant strategic goals, yeah. aimed at digitizing and thereby monetizing the D&D experience like never before.
And this push really ramped up around 2020, didn't it? Fueled by a few things happening at once.
Definitely. You had record sales, partly driven by the pandemic, pushing play online. You had the ongoing Stranger Things effect, keeping D&D mainstream. And critically, WotC bought D&D Beyond.
The really popular digital toolset people were already using.
Exactly. Bringing that in-house was a key part of the digital strategy. It seemed like the perfect storm to accelerate the digital and monetization push.
And then came that comment from the former WotC president, Cynthia Williams, the undermonetized comment.
Yes. That definitely poured gasoline on the fire. Despite D&D's huge popularity and success, she stated publicly that the brand is really undermonetized.
Which, to players, probably sounded like, we want to squeeze more money out of you.
That's exactly how many sources indicate it was perceived. Now, some sources acknowledge that, maybe objectively, compared to other giant media IPs, D&D could generate more revenue.
But phrasing it as undermonetized
just felt like a clear signal that the priority was shifting purely to profit extraction, maybe even at the expense of the game experience people loved. It became a real flashpoint.
So what did this digital plan actually involve, according to the sources?
Several key parts. There was the whole One D&D initiative, which is now basically the 2024 rules update, originally meant to tie tightly into a new digital platform.
The D&D Beyond acquisition we mentioned.
Right. And then the big one, development of a brand new, ambitious 3D virtual tabletop. Sources called it Sigil, or maybe Sigil.
But even as this was rolling out, players were raising concerns.
Oh yeah, right from the start. Sources detail worries about aggressive monetization, like selling virtual minis individually, maybe loot boxes for digital dice, that sort of thing.
And fears about moving away from physical books entirely, toward subscriptions.
Definitely. A fear that the traditional tabletop experience might get sidelined or become secondary to a purely digital subscription-based future.
And how has the actual development of WotC's own digital tools, like that VTT, been going?
Purportedly, not great. Sources suggest the Sigil VTT has really struggled. It apparently only runs smoothly on PC, despite hopes or promises for wider device support.
Which is pretty limiting for a modern digital tool.
Yeah, one source specifically contrasted it with an independent VTT called Fablecraft, noting that it runs well on PC, Mac, and mobile, and has innovative features built in. Makes WotC's effort look a bit behind the curve, perhaps.
And this internal struggle with their own VTT looks even worse when you compare it to, well, Baldur's Gate 3.
Oh, absolutely. The contrast is incredibly stark. Baldur's Gate 3, licensed out to Larian Studios, was just a monster hit in 2023.
Critically acclaimed, massive sales, Game of the Year awards everywhere.
And sources really dig into why it succeeded, pointing to Larian's whole approach.
Which was different from WotC's perceived strategy.
Very different, according to Larian's own statements cited in sources. They focused on making the game they wanted to play, driven by passion, idealism, fun.
They took their time, used early access for feedback.
Crucially, they had creative control. And they consciously avoided stuffing it with microtransactions or things designed purely to extract more money. They prioritized a complete, amazing experience.
And the result? Sources say BG3 basically saved Hasbro financially last year.
Yeah, estimates mentioned are around $2 billion in sales, a huge lifeline for Hasbro. And the irony, sources stress, is that this massive success came from a game WotC didn't develop or control day to day.
Which just makes their own internal digital struggles, like with Sigil, look even more pronounced. Baffling, even.
Definitely. And this whole digital focus ties directly back to Hasbro's overall financial state and their big corporate strategy.
The playing to win strategy.
Right. Which reportedly involves milking as much revenue as possible from video games and leans heavily on licensed and digital gaming as the main growth drivers.
There were even comments about using AI in D&D.
Yeah, sources referenced former Hasbro CEO Chris Cox talking about deploying AI significantly and liberally based on their understanding of player behavior.
So the takeaway from sources seems to be that this intense focus on digital licensing AI, it might come at a cost.
Potentially, yes. The concern raised is that it could mean less books and less focus on improving the game itself, the traditional tabletop game.
Yeah.
If all the resources and attention are going towards these other digital and licensed avenues.
What happens to the core game?
Exactly.
So think about your own D&D playing, you listening right now. Does this potential digital-first future, maybe subscriptions, microtransactions, less focus on physical books, does that match how you want to play?
And what does it mean for the tabletop game if WotC's main focus seems to be shifting towards digital monetization and licensing, especially when the biggest recent success, BG3, came from a totally different approach than their internal efforts seem to be taking. Where does that leave the traditional game?
That question of where the investment is actually going, what's being prioritized, it leads us straight into looking at Hasbro's overall financial health, ODC's performance, and specifically how the new D&D edition reportedly landed.
And the picture painted by the sources regarding Hasbro's recent financial state is, well, pretty grim.
Strong language used.
Very strong. Things like financial black hole nightmare of death, descriptions of various Hasbro properties failing, leading to major cutbacks, losing market share, falling stock price.
There's a big revenue drop figure mentioned, too.
A 15% revenue drop year over year, cited in one source. It's a tough environment.
And this led to significant layoffs, didn't it?
Huge layoffs in late 2023. Reports mention 1,800 employees let go, which is about 20% of their global workforce. That's substantial.
So within that difficult picture, Hasbro is betting big on tabletop, on Magic and D&D.
Sources indicate, yes, they're gambling heavily on WotC's big properties to help shore things up, to be pillars of stability and growth.
But wasn't there also bad news about tabletop sales themselves?
There was. Sources indicated that tabletop gaming sales overall actually saw a decline this year, especially towards the end of the year. Sales reported as down compared to the previous year's final quarter.
Okay, so it's against that backdrop that WotC launched the new D&D 2024 core rulebooks.
Exactly. The updated Player's Handbook, DMG, Monster Manual, rolled out over several months, starting late last year.
And that staggered release itself drew some criticism.
Sources noted some community criticism about the timing and strategy, spreading the core books out like that.
How did Hasbro initially talk about the sales of these new books?
Their public statements were carefully worded, let's say. They reportedly claimed the new Player's Handbook was the fastest-selling D&D product ever.
Okay, fastest-selling product ever, that sounds specific.
Extremely specific. And sources noted that specificity immediately raised skepticism. Why not fastest-selling edition? Why no actual numbers? It felt like a potentially misleading or evasive claim.
And then came the leaks or insider reports.
Right. Which painted a very, very different picture. Much more grim, as sources put it.
How bad did they suggest it was?
Sales reportedly described internally as a disaster for HEW, presumably Hasbro Wizards. One source even conveyed the feeling that the leaks were just a glimpse at the true measure of just how screwed we all are, implying it was even worse.
And Hasbro didn't deny these leaks.
Apparently not. Sources highlighted that Hasbro reportedly hasn't bothered to rebuff the leaks with any contradictory data, which to many looked like a tacit admission that the negative reports were probably true.
Okay, but here's the weird part. Despite all that declining tabletop sales, reports of disastrous new book sales, Hasbro apparently labeled D&D a growth brand.
Exactly. That's the paradox sources point out. It makes no immediate sense.
What does being a growth brand even mean in Hasbro speak?
It means, supposedly, that D&D is marked for disproportionate human and capital investment to fuel growth.
Which leads to the obvious question sources raise. Why? If the book's bombed, where's the growth? And where's the investment going?
The explanation offered in the sources is that you have to look where WotC's revenue growth actually came from last year. And it wasn't tabletop.
Ah, so the growth wasn't from D&D books or Magic cards?
No. Sources argue WotC's only revenue growth last year came from licensed and digital gaming.
Specifically Baldur's Gate 3.
Baldur's Gate 3, overwhelmingly. And also, interestingly, Monopoly Go, the mobile game based on another Hasbro IP. According to these sources, that was the sole driver of WotC's financial growth, papering over the decline in tabletop.
Which just reinforces that perception of a major strategic shift away from the traditional core business.
Absolutely. And while Hasbro's overall situation is tough, sources did note the stock price showed some stability, maybe recovered a bit from its lows.
Almost like a recession-proof stock.
That comparison was made, yeah. And again, that stability might be thanks to the licensed digital performance, especially BG3, not the core tabletop side.
So thinking about Hasbro's rough financial state, the layoffs, their coping strategy, how does that impact the D&D game you actually play?
Well, what does this picture tell us? If the money, the growth, is clearly coming from licensed games and digital, while tabletop sales are reportedly struggling.
Where is that disproportionate investment likely to really go?
Based on this analysis, it seems almost certain that resources and focus will continue to flow towards where the money's being made. Licensed games, digital platforms. which could mean less for traditional book development.
And this focus on digital and licensing, especially while WotC seems to struggle with its own digital projects, highlights another problem area: their track record with video games.
Yeah, the sources paint a pretty consistent picture there. A pattern of big announcements, ambitious projects, followed by cancellations and failures.
Like those canceled projects early last year.
Exactly. Reports mentioned at least 5 unannounced game projects based on WotC IPs getting axed by Hasbro in early 2023. Just gone.
And there are past examples people point to as well.
Oh yeah. D&D Dark Alliance is a common one. Reportedly so bad it's being delisted from stores. And Magic Legends, the free-to-play RPG.
What happened with that?
Sources say it never even made it out of beta. Canceled less than a year after its early access started. A total flop.
And the most recent example was that Skeleton Key studio closure.
Right. That untitled AAA horror game they were working on. Skeleton Key was an internal WotC studio, reportedly built from scratch with really experienced talent, like Christian Daly from Dragon Age and Anthem.
And Hasbro just shut it down.
Canceled the project, closed the studio. Sources framed it really starkly. Another AAA game dead, another studio wasted. Seen as more proof, watch Hasbro have absolutely no clue what they're doing with internal game development.
Do the sources offer reasons why these projects keep failing? Especially when licensed games like BG3 can succeed so massively.
Several reasons are suggested. One is just the intense financial pressure on Hasbro, leading them to cancel projects too early, before they've even had a chance.
Not committing long-term.
Yeah, a perceived unwillingness to make the long-term investments a normal game studio needs. They seem to panic when profits don't immediately appear, prioritizing short-term profit over actually finishing quality games.
And again, Baldur's Gate 3 is the big contrast.
Always. Sources hammer this point. Lorien's success proves a D&D game can be a huge hit if you do it right. Give developers creative control, give them time, focus on fun and quality first.
But what Hasbro doesn't seem to learn from that.
The argument in sources is no. They seem incapable of long-term thinking. They stick to this pattern of shutting things down, cashing in whenever they can, instead of making the kind of patient investment Lorien made in BG3.
So, if they struggle so much with delivering successful video games themselves, what does that say about their other digital plans? Like the Sigil VTT, or translating D&D effectively into other digital formats you might use.
Does this pattern just show they don't understand game development? Or is it purely down to that corporate pressure for instant results, making long-term investment impossible? It raises big questions about their digital future.
And this apparent disconnect, this history of missteps, the financial pressure, it's all led to this breakdown in trust we keep circling back to.
Absolutely. Which became really visible in that other recent controversy, the whole debate around content creators and sponsorships for the new books.
What happened there exactly?
Sources describe WotC reaching out to various YouTubers and creators in the TTRPG space. The offer was basically free, early copies of the new player's handbook.
In exchange for what? Previews? Reviews?
Mostly framed as previews, according to sources, often involving NDAs. The key distinction made was that these generally weren't paid review copies, and WotC apparently stated there was no expectation of a positive review.
So just show the book off, generate buzz, a kind of promotion.
Essentially, yeah.
Yep.
A form of advertisement for the new release. Seems straightforward enough on the surface.
But it wasn't straightforward. It caused a big debate.
A huge, very public debate within the TTRPG creator community itself.
About whether to accept the books or not.
Exactly. Sources discuss this real tension creators felt. On one hand, you get early access, potential channel exposure, free product, practical benefits.
But on the other hand,
Concerns about selling out, worries about maintaining integrity with their audience, appearing biased towards WotC, especially given everything else that had been happening.
that distinction between previewing and reviewing became important.
Some creators tried to draw that line, yeah, saying they could show the book neutrally without giving an opinion. But the whole situation was fraught.
And what did this whole debate reveal, according to the sources?
One major takeaway highlighted was just how toxic the Wizards of the Coast brand, or maybe the whole Hasbro WotC entity, has become for many people in the hobby.
Especially after the OGL crisis.
That's seen as the real turning point, yeah. Post-OGL crisis, the trust has just gone for many. Sources paraphrase the sentiment as people genuinely asking themselves, do I really want any association with that thing? Referring to Hasbro as this, like, toxic corporate entity.
And the argument is this wasn't always the case.
No. Sources explicitly state This level of suspicion and reluctance is new, just the last few years. And they put the blame squarely on WotC and Hasbro's own actions. It's all Wizards of the Coast and Hasbro's doing.
So the basic trust level from the hobby towards the company is just shot.
Severely damaged, yeah.
Yeah.
Sources question why creators would want to link their personal brand to a company viewed so negatively by a large part of the community. Why risk that association?
There was that contrast drawn with the past, right? With TSR or early WotC.
Yeah, a powerful point. Back then, working for TSR or early Wizards was seen as the dream of a lifetime for many hobbyists.
But not anymore.
One source stated it very bluntly. I don't think that holds true for Wizards of the Coast today. That shift is framed as a massive self-inflicted wound, mainly from the OGL mess, maybe impossible to fully recover from in terms of goodwill.
Some sources even tied it to that reported goal of making D&D a billion-dollar brand, like corporate targets are driving these trust-destroying decisions.
That connection was definitely made, yeah. Suggesting financial pressures are forcing actions that alienate the community.
So, for you listening, maybe watching these creators online, why should you care if they take a free book from WotC?
Well, because this whole controversy, this debate, it tells you something really important about the state of the brand right now, how it's perceived by the community you're in.
It reflects that broken trust, the questions about WotC's direction and ethics.
And how the creators you follow are trying to navigate that relationship, trying to stay credible while still covering the game. It's a window into the current health of that whole relationship.
Looking back at everything we've covered, the history book fight, the OGL explosion, the shaky digital plans, Hasbro's money troubles, the poor new edition sales reports, the canceled games, the sponsorship debate, it really feels like D&D is just constantly swirling in controversy lately.
That's a recurring theme in the sources, definitely.
Yeah.
The D&D is just always at the center of some sort of controversy, but it's been particularly intense these past 3 years.
Now, sources did mention that this isn't entirely unprecedented, right? There's historical context.
Yeah, they briefly touched on past dramas. The satanic panic in the 80s, though, one source made the interesting, maybe controversial argument that the notoriety actually helped the game grow.
The Gygax Arneson disputes.
Right, the co-creator fallout, or the Buck Rogers thing, where TSR pushed that game because an executive owned the IP, sidelining D&D for a while.
Right.
So controversy isn't new.
But the OGL fiasco is consistently flagged as different, a real turning point.
Absolutely. Across the board, sources describe it as the moment Hasbro WotC simply showed their true colors. It seemed to fundamentally break something in the relationship in a way past issues maybe didn't.
And then there's the pylon of other recent issues contributing to this feeling.
Right. The perceived insults to older players, the criticisms of the new art style, less action, more slice of life, some said, hiring a CEO from Blizzard, known for layoffs and microtransactions.
The relentless digital push, the anniversary book framing, it all adds up.
It does. And amidst all this, sources floated an interesting, maybe slightly cynical idea about the controversies themselves.
Which is?
That while some are clearly self-inflicted, Hasbro just messing up, foot opening their mouths, as one source put it, maybe others are manufactured by outside forces, or maybe even
deliberately stoked by WotC itself, just to keep D&D in the headlines.
That possibility was raised, yeah. Using controversy is a weird form of marketing. Hard to prove, but it's out there as a theory.
Now, in response to all this chaos, some sources offered a kind of philosophical way for players to cope. What was that?
It's the idea that maybe you shouldn't get too worked up because at the end of the day, it's not your game, it's their game.
Meaning Hasbro owns the IP, they can do what they want with it.
Legally, yes, that's the argument. Hasbro owns Dungeons & Dragons, Inc. They make the corporate decisions. Your power as a player isn't in controlling that IP.
Where is the player's power then, according to this view?
It's in your choice. You can choose to keep playing older editions you love. You can use the Creative Commons SRD to make your own stuff, or use third-party content. You can play totally different games.
Or just tweak the rules at your own table. Homebrew it.
Exactly. The game you play, the rules you use, the stories you tell with your friends, that is your game, regardless of what Hasbro does with the official brand.
One source even framed it as maybe the current version, 5e or 2024, just isn't designed for me anymore, speaking as perhaps an older player.
Right. A recognition that the company's direction might just diverge from your personal preferences, and that's okay because you have other options.
And those other options are becoming more important.
Hugely important, according to sources. They really emphasize the rise of other awesome games out there.
Like Pathfinder, indie RPGs.
Pathfinder, tons of innovative indie games, OSR games like Shadow Dark that capture that old-school feel, even new games from big influencers like Critical Role's Daggerheart.
And these are seen as real alternatives for players maybe unhappy with WotC.
Definitely. Sources see them as vital options for people disillusioned, tired of the drama, or just looking for something different. They argue these alternatives might be the real core of the TTRPG hobby now, attracting players beyond just the D&D brand.
Okay, so given this constant swirl of controversy, these different paths, how do you, listening now, make sense of it all? How do you decide who or what to trust, how to feel about D&D?
Does that "it's not your game" idea work for you? Does it feel freeing to separate the corporation from your home game? Or do you feel more ownership, like the community should have a voice in D&D's future and legacy? It's a really core question, isn't it?
It really is. So wrapping up this deep dive, it's clear the whole landscape around D&D, WotC, and Hasbro right now is, well, it's complicated, it's messy.
Definitely complex. We've seen that constant tension between legacy and monetization, the big strategic shift to digital and licensing, the financial pressures driving decisions.
The impact of all these controversies on trust and brand perception, and this really vibrant ecosystem of third-party creators and alternative games bubbling up.
The current state, based on these sources, seems defined by those financial pressures pushing WotC towards digital licensing, by the resulting controversies that have seriously damaged trust, and by a community that's really grappling with all this, looking for info and actively exploring other options.
So let's end with a final thought for you to chew on, pulling everything together from the sources, based on what we've discussed. If Hasbro's actual money growth is coming mainly from licensed hits like Baldur's Gate 3 and digital stuff, while the traditional tabletop sales are reportedly struggling.
And if these ongoing controversies keep damaging the relationship between the official D&D brand, its core players, and those crucial independent creators,
does the real future, the long-term health of tabletop Dungeons & Dragons, the game played with books and dice around a table, does that future truly rest primarily with Wizards of the Coast and Hasbro anymore?
Or is the future of the hobby increasingly being shaped, maybe even secured, by the energy and creativity of those independent publishers, the designers making alternative games, and ultimately by you, the players, who keep adapting, evolving, and finding ways to play the games you love at your own tables, regardless of whatever storms are happening at the corporate level?